This time we got up here an absolute classic, the Sturmgewehr. This particular one is MP44 marked, all right? The first real assault rifle as we know it today. Now, the Russian Fedorov of World War I and really post-World War I fame, technically speaking, was the first true assault rifle because it did fire an intermediate cartridge. But for all practical purposes, the gun that we know of as the grandfather of the assault rifle is the German Sturmgewehr. Now, what's an assault rifle? Now, fires an intermediate cartridge. In this case, 8x33, 8mm by 33mm, or otherwise known as 8mm Kurs. All right, whereas it's partway between the power of like 9mm Parabellum that was used in, say, the World War II German MP40, and then 7.92 Mauser that was used in the K98K or the FG42. This gun kind of bridges that gap, an intermediate cartridge. So it can be used up close like a submachine gun, but you can also use it to 200 and 300 meters like a rifle. That concept was so revolutionary that it's being used to this day. On all the major armed forces around the world field some sort of assault rifle as a primary service rifle. Of course, ours is the M16. Russians, AK-47, AKM, AK-74, and that entire family. It all started with this. Germans started fielding this in around 1943, and it kind of developed from there. The initial weapon was developed off a weapon based by Haenel, which is MKB-42H. That was a pre-production prototype test weapon. Main difference between the H and the standard Sturmgewehr: one, the H fires from an open bolt. This fires from a closed bolt. And when you see the gas tube go all the way out to the front sight, that's how you could spot an MKB-42H. Magazines are the same ammunition. One thing about this magazine, I'll go ahead and pull it off the rack here so we can talk. 30-round magazine, but really only designed to take about 22, 25 rounds max. A couple reasons for that. One, it's bad about, you got a bad nosedive issue once you get it fully loaded. So that the front of the round is not properly supported. So once you get above 25 rounds in it, you get a lot of nosedive. You have the chance of getting a nosedive stoppage with this magazine. Also, when it's in the gun, you have a lot of front and back play. Right? That works against you when the gun's cycling. Now you can see as a right-hander, the Germans had in mind where a soldier would come up with his left-hand thumb in order to change mags. All right? Now, when the Russians went down the path of the AK-47, they decided a rocking magazine was better, that locked in the front, in the rear, and then you had a flapper magazine release. That is a superior way to set up versus this mag release. As you can see, this magazine release essentially flipped is the same one we have on the M16 and M4. And you essentially have a very similar cutout. It just happens to be on the opposite side on the M16 and the M4. One thing about the M16 and M4 magazine, Eugene Stoner and his crew did a good job. A lot less forward and aft magazine flop. So the magazine well supports the magazine inside the little receiver dramatically better than it does in the Sturmgewehr. These magazines may be claimed to hold 30 rounds. They only really hold about 22 rounds properly. A lot of stamped sheet metal with this gun, fairly heavy gun. Another thing you see about it is stamped sheet metal handguard. So I can tell you, in about one magazine, this thing gets very, very hot. That's why when you see me in my videos, inevitably shooting it, I'm holding it with gloves. Also, it's not uncommon when you see soldiers in World War II shooting it, they're holding it down here by the magazine well magazine area, which is less than ideal. You always want to try to get up on the bore line, if at all possible, to control the gun. Why the Germans went with the sheet metal for the handguard, not really sure. They carried it later on to not only the early G3 variants, but also the German G1, which is a licensed version of the FNFAL that the Germans had. It had a metal handguard. So they pursued that for a little while. They weren't the only country to do that, the most notable. And then after a while, of course, they got away from that with the G3 and decided maybe a sheet metal handguard isn't such a good thing, especially when the gun gets hot. All right. Gas operated, we're going to bust the gun down here in a minute. I'm going to take you through some of the internals. Does not have a bolt hold open device. So when the gun runs dry, all right, it closes on an empty chamber, just like with an AK. Unlike an M16 or an M4 where the bolt locks to the rear on an empty mag, this particular weapon does not have a bolt hold open device. May sound like a big deal, but to be honest with you, in combat for the average soldier, it's not that big of a deal. It's not uncommon for soldiers to run around with their bolt locked to the rear on an empty mag and be unaware of it, allowing dirt and debris in the chamber and the operating mechanism. Also, when that happens and a soldier gets a dead trigger, kind of a mushy trigger, and they kind of have that WTF moment, it's much easier to pick up on the click that you get from an empty chamber, and now you realize, oh, I need to reload this gun. So for the average soldier, for the average bear, for the average Joe, it makes for a less complex weapon and not necessarily a less effective weapon to not have a bolt hold open device. Fixed charging handle that's on the left side, so it's great for a right-hander to run the gun. He can reach up with his left hand, his support hand, and rack the gun and drive on. One thing, if you watch the YouTube video I have, this thing, essentially, the bolt carrier never bottoms out in the rear of the receiver. So you'll see it come back, hesitate, and go slightly forward. That makes the gun very controllable. It's a long stroke, long recoil weapon. Therefore, you don't have the bolt carrier hitting the rear and jarring the weapon and increasing felt recoil. It comes to a slow, gradual stop and then goes back forward. That makes for a fairly long action. Right, because you have to have a lot of travel for the bolt carrier to come to the rear before it starts going forward. But one of the pluses you get out of it is a very controllable weapon. For a weapon of this type, extremely controllable and burst fire. All right, now, before we start busting it down, let's talk through the selector switch setup here. Kind of along the lines of what you saw with the British Sten, frankly, where you did fire mode selection with a cross bolt safety. Now, the Sten doesn't have a flip lever like this, but you did do fire mode selection with a cross bolt safety. So with the Sturmgewehr, this is your safety. All right, in this case, it's on safe with the S, and then when you cover up the S, it reveals the F for fire, and now you can pull the trigger. If you want to go semi-automatic or fully automatic, you do it with this cross bolt. You push cross left to right, and that selects whether you're going fully automatic or semi-automatic. I tell you, actually from an end user point of view, pretty slick. The downside is complexity. What you see is, and why this was abandoned as time went on, is it made the low receiver more complex. And also, these guns are not necessarily known for long-lasting life. Talked to my buddy out at Battlefield Vegas, and they'll tell you they got some rental ones. They've had to replace some of the trigger units in them because when they rent them out, after a while, the trigger components from World War II original guns give up the ghost. So, great gun for 5,000 or 6,000 rounds, which on the battlefield is a long time. A rental gun in Battlefield Vegas, not necessarily ideal in terms of the metallurgy used. We're about ready to field strip this thing. Stay tuned. All right, gang, time to field strip the Sturmgewehr, MP44 mark gun, made in 1944, by the way. You see the serial number here, 5606. Then it has a letter suffix, and then that 44 stamp tells you it was made in 1944. All right, first thing we want to do, make sure the gun's clear. So magazine out, visually inspect the chamber. Notice, by the way, the spring-loaded ejection port cover flips up, and oh, by the way, the M16 M4 one was copied and inspired by the one on the Sturmgewehr. It doesn't flip down like the M16 or M4, it flips up. So, to make sure it's visually cleared, we're good to go. Here's your push pin, your cross pin takedown pin like you see along the lines with HK. HK has widely used these takedown pins over the years. You push it across. Sometimes you have to depress that little spring-loaded part to get it. It can be a little bit of a bear. There we go. Get it going. And then pull the pin out like this. All right. Then you can pull it out to that degree. All right, now you're going to see the Achilles heel right off the bat with the Sturmgewehr. Recoil spring is housed in the buttstock and goes back into a hole in the wooden buttstock. That's the Achilles heel. Oops, a little dumped out on me here. That's the Achilles heel to this gun. All right, you can easily put one of these things out of action by smashing the buttstock on the ground, cracking the buttstock, and now the gun won't run. The recoil spring runs in the buttstock, inside, basically a hole drilled into buttstock, and it'll shut the gun down. Now, take that off. You can see, by the way, since the guts just fell out, very easily disassemble. Unlike the HK series, the trigger group just pivots down, and it has a pivot pin here, but it's staked in place. It doesn't come apart like the one on the HK does, whereas HK took this design and they use a push pin there along the lines of the push pin they use for the buttstock here on the Sturmgewehr. They use a push pin right here to take the trigger group off. That increases modularity for the HK designs. It's actually a pretty slick design. Once that comes out and that drops down, now the bolt carrier can come right out the rear. And you can see this particular gun is in mint condition, barely looks even fired at all, and I believe it is serial number matching. It is serial number matching for the bolt carrier and the upper and lower receiver, which is pretty slick. Notice the gas piston. Notice these ridges. What we've seen now, and you see AK's had these back in the past, not this many, but a couple ridges cut up front, is that largely is unnecessary. And you see a lot of the newer products come out of the Kalashnikov concern. They've done away with these grooves entirely. The Germans obviously had a lot of it here. You can see the charging handle is part of the bolt carrier, and then this interacts like that. When it's locked in the battery, it goes, pushes it down and locks it in the battery in the trunnion. There's a trunnion right here, a machine steel trunnion that's stamped and basically riveted and locked into place inside the sheet metal receiver right here. And then this portion of the bolt locks down into here, and that's how you get your headspace, locks it in the battery. Now, when the bolt carrier comes to the rear, it grabs the bolt, pulls it up out of battery, and then cycles the gun. As it goes forward and chambers around, it comes forward and then pushes it back down and locks it into place in the trunnion. Really slick design. Really slick design. Robust, reliable, had a good reputation for functional reliability in the field. Like I said, Wink Link magazine, load 20 or 22 rounds in it, by and large, good to go. Now, you see a cutout right here on this side of the receiver. This is for your trip lever right there. In order to actuate the gun, when the bolt carrier goes all the way in the battery, it hits it and allows it to trip into fire and fully automatic fire. And as you can see down in here, when I push that left to right, you can see the additional complexity versus a select fire turbo group on like an HK or whatnot, where the safety, the semi-auto selector, and the full auto selector are all one and the same. They're not detached into two separate components like they are in Sturmgewehr. As you can tell, a lot of stamped sheet metal involved. As a matter of fact, Justin, my film guy here, was asking, was this the first gun that used this much stamped sheet metal? As far as assault rifles go, I would say yeah. MP40 used a lot of stamped sheet metal, certainly as much as this, but in terms of a assault rifle, a general service rifle, I would say yeah, that this gun kind of led the way on stamped sheet metal for a gun of this type, this category. Real simple gun. As you can tell, simple to maintain. The only thing we haven't done here is we haven't taken off the gas plug. I'll go ahead and unscrew that real quick. I got a disassembly tool here in the trap door in the buttstock. And that allows me to come up front, get the gas plug, if I can bust it loose, hopefully. And maybe I can't. Maybe I can't. There we go. Got it. Gas plug unscrews. And that allows you to maintain the gas system all the way through the gas tube and the gas plug and clean it all the way through, which is a plus when you're shooting corrosive ammo. You gotta remember, World War II German ammo was corrosive, so as they're shooting this gun, they gotta maintain the gas tube, they gotta maintain the bore, they gotta maintain the receiver and get the corrosive fouling out of the gun so as to avoid rust and corrosion. All right, coming up, we're going to get this thing back together, and then we're going to do some comparison between this and maybe a couple other assault rifles you might recognize. Stay tuned. Hey gang, Larry Vickers here. I've got a tip for you from CCW Safe. This is in regards to your sights and the lighting conditions that you may face for your concealed carry weapon. If you notice this particular one, this is a Vickers Elite Glock from Wilson Combat. This has a plain black rear, and in particular it has a Ameriglow HD front yellow-green. The reason I choose this front sight, it's something I can see not only during the day, but at night. It has tritium in the middle. Think about how you're going to carry your pistol, where you're going to carry your pistol, and what the lighting may be when you bring it out. And it needs to be at least something on the front sight that's big and bold and jumps out at you. That's why I like these HD style front sights. My advice, go to your indoor range, try a wide variety of pistols, and find out what works best for you on your carry pistol. All right, stay tuned, keep it safe. All right, gang, let's put this thing back together. Let's go ahead and put our gas plug on first. Screws in, no problem. Had a little question here on the break from Justin, my camera guy, about spare parts availability for the Sturmgewehr. Unfortunately, I mean, they're still out there and they're not cheap. Back in the day, IMA brought in a bunch of parts kits, and I was able to get like a spare bolt carrier, a spare trigger mechanism, recoil spring. I was able to get some of that stuff at fairly reasonable prices. Now when you find that stuff, oftentimes you're finding that stuff on Gunbroker and whatnot, and they are rude money. The magazines, $300, $400, $500 a piece. So this is now no longer a cheap gun to play with. Gun's probably a good $25,000 gun, and if you really set it up with mags and everything, you know, you're going to be pushing $30K by the time you get spare parts in the equation. So this is no longer, at one time they were fairly common and they're still out there, but these things are big bucks. Remember, they haven't made these things since World War II, so it's not like they're making them every day. There was some reproductions made in Germany back in the day. Those didn't really do very well. They cut a lot of corners to get them done, and that company is no longer in business. So Sturmgewehr itself is not a cheap toy to play with. Ammunition, interestingly enough, Privy Partisan makes ammo for this. The good news about it is it's non-corrosive, which is great, boxer prime, so you can reload it, and it's a little bit softer ammo than the standard full World War II Germany mil-spec 8mm curves, which has got some snap to it. The Privy stuff is downloaded a little bit, so it's a little bit softer on the gun. So that's generally when I shoot it, which is once in a blue moon, I'll drag out some Privy Partisan that I have stashed away and run it through my Sturmgewehr. All right, now I got the gas plug in. Next thing up, we're going to put the bolt and bolt carrier together, piece of cake. All right, you want to set it together like this, and then you want to come in down from the top. Maybe hold your mouth a certain way so it doesn't fall apart. Kind of line it up like that. There we go. Oh, yeah, and it'll slide into place once you get it. There you go. And it'll go into place for you. Like that. It goes all the way in the battery, locks all the way in the battery, and it goes in as easy as it comes out. You remember watching the video and the thing just fell out? Same thing. Now, I want to take this. It can only go one way. It can't go in the upper tube because that tube's too small. So it goes here. All right. And then now you want to snake it down into the buttstock. Same thing. It'll go in that lower tube. Pull your pin out and then close your lower receiver. Hold that closed as you put butt cap on. And as you can see where HK got the idea for not only the spring-loaded takedown pin, but also the way their buttstock interacts, as well as the trigger mechanism. You want to get it, push it in place, good to go. Now, your disassembly tool, you can also have back in here, I've seen it before, where they'll have little instruction manuals, field instruction manuals for soldiers, disassembly tool, a spare firing pin. You can have spare extractor, whatnot. So you got a little trap door here to put in your tools. All right, like that. Now let's go ahead and do a functions check, make sure the gun's clear. Want to go ahead and put it on safe, attempt to fire, weapon does not fire. Put it on fire, pull the trigger, hold the trigger to the rear, release the trigger, it should fire. Now it is currently on semi, so I pull the trigger to the rear, cycle it, release it, click, and fire. Now, cycle it, push the cross bolt to select the full auto on the other side, pull the trigger, then cycle the bolt and you'll hear the hammer follow, and there's your full auto function check. All right, so that's your Sturmgewehr put back together. A couple things about it. Sights, suffers from the same sight setup along the lines of the AK. Very similar sight picture, but the arrangement is also very similar in respect that your sight radius, the distance from the rear sight to the front sight, is roughly the same as the barrel, which is not conducive to your best rifle accuracy. Also has a sliding ladder style rear sight like you see on the K98K or the Russians used on the Mosin-Nagant and whatnot. So they kind of carried that sight arrangement over. Less than ideal. Far better setup would have been to come back here on the upper receiver, not on the buttstock, but on the upper receiver, and have, I mean, if you're not going to have this slider, have ideally an aperture. The thing you saw the Germans do with the FG42, they really thought out of the box for that time frame, and they have an adjustable aperture that's mounted back much closer to the eye. Far superior sights than this. Now you can take one of these things. I certainly wouldn't do it because you're looking at something that's the price of a good used car, actually, or a good brand new car, depending on the brand you buy. You could take a pick rail, put it right here, and put something like an aim point on it, and you could actually have a gun that you could do some pretty serious work with. Of course, you need to wear gloves. You need to do something to insulate your hand up here for when this puppy gets hot. All right, now, threaded muzzle for a variety of different devices up front, suppressors and whatnot that were never really used. In theory, you had them on paper, but you never really used them. This is something that later on in the war, in 1945 and such, the Germans did away with this threading and this muzzle nut. It kind of makes you wonder why they even did it to begin with. What they thought that this threaded muzzle nut was going to give them, and the time and the effort and the materials wasted on that. It's along the same lines of why the Germans were making stuff like PPKs and Mauser HSCs and small pistols late into the war. You got to ask yourself, why are you doing that? Flush that, put all your effort into making service pistols like the P38 instead of wasting your time on something that's not going to make a hill of beans on the battlefield with small handguns. Same thing with stuff like this. Why are they wasting their time threading the muzzle on this, knowing damn well there's very little to no accessories that are ever being used out in the field that required a threaded muzzle? All right, but classic case with the Germans in World War II, too little, too late. Very innovative, really thought out of the box with a lot of their stuff, but certainly too little, too late. All right, now it's time to get a couple contemporaries and bring it up here and compare it to the Sturmgewehr. Stay tuned. Hey gang, I got an AK up here that I want to compare to the Sturmgewehr. This is the gun that's most commonly compared to it, and everybody's like, oh, this is nothing, the Russians just copied the Sturmgewehr with the AK and yada, yada, yada. That's largely propaganda. Do I feel like this gun influenced the AK? Without question. I mean, without a doubt. Do I think it's just a blatant copy? No. There's a lot of differences between the two. The concept of the intermediate select fire magazine-fed assault rifle, there's no doubt in my mind this concept influenced this gun, but in terms of design, a lot of differences. All right, now some of the things that are the same, or very similar, I should say, are almost a matter of happenstance, like the sights. This has a hooded front sight. This has a sliding front sight, ladder style front sight like we talked about. So does this, non-hooded up here, but you got to remember, they more or less just took this off the Mosin-Nagant and away you go. So yeah, even though they copied the Sturmgewehr rear, the sight setup, not really so much. Essentially, both countries went down the same path with the K98K and the Mosin-Nagant, and they just kind of did a cut and paste of the sights over to the Sturmgewehr and the AK. Magazine. This magazine's not a bad magazine, but it's got some obvious flaws. Obviously, we talked about the front and back wobble. The great thing about the AK, a fantastic magazine. Always has been, always will be. Doesn't have a bolt hold open device. Doesn't lock the bolt to the rear on an empty magazine. But the way it's designed, that constant curve, very robust, very reliable. You can see the ribs. You might argue that they got that from the Germans. That's entirely possible. The big thing here is the way it locks in. This magazine locks into the receiver in a much better fashion than the one in the Sturmgewehr. All right, this one locks in and you have this push button. You have a lot of back and forth flop like I showed you earlier. This particular one, because it locks here and here, locks into the receiver dramatically better. Also, reinforced feed lips up top. This puppy out and hold my mouth a certain way. You can see the reinforced feed lips right here. Makes for a far more robust magazine. This particular one is not bad in that area. You see this little sleeve that's wrapped around or on both sides, essentially spot welded into place along the lines of what HK's done over the years. Not a bad setup. It reinforced the feed lips as well. But the AK magazine, great magazine. Always has been, always will be. All right, and the way it locks in the gun, not necessarily the ideal way in terms of being able to do a very quick magazine change, but in terms of durability and the way it locks in the gun, far superior. Now, one thing that the Russians got from the Germans that they did not get from the Sturmgewehr was the underfolding buttstock. This is an underfolder, AKMS. This particular one's a Hungarian semi-automatic FEG that was brought in. Collectible gun, mint condition, as you can see. But this underfolder here, almost a direct copy of the one on the MP40. Most notable difference is the MP40 one has a full oval profile here. This one has to be cut out in a U shape in order to clear the magazine as it folds. In order to clear the magazine, it has to have that cut out. Now, very compact folding buttstock. The problem is, just like the one on the MP40, fold this puppy, is you get the wobble. Notice the wobble. And this is a brand new gun. This gun's in mint condition. Granted, it was made years ago, but it's mint. And look at the up and down wobble. The MP40 buttstock and the one on the AKMS, this one is notorious for that. That's why when the Russians went in a different direction with the AK-74 series, a completely different buttstock, very rigid, much superior design. Not necessarily so compact, went to the side, but their triangle buttstock was far superior in terms of the way it locked up and the fact it eliminated wobble. All right, so that's kind of your overview, quick down and dirty, between the AK and the Sturmgewehr. Obviously guns, this gun influenced this one, but by no means would you just come out and say it was a blatant copy. All right, next is going to be the M4. We're going to talk about the M4 comparison to the Sturmgewehr. Stay tuned. All right, gang, M4. This is my beloved BCM, my favorite AR company in the entire world. Paul Buffoni, the owner, is a really good friend of mine. Great dude. Sponsor of my YouTube channel. This is the same one we used in the M4 cutaway video. That's now got well over 1 million views on my YouTube channel. We're able to see inside the gun and film the gun functioning as it was fired. Great one to talk about differences and comparisons with the Sturmgewehr. Right off the bat, you can see the mag catch situation. And I'll flip it over. Here's your mag catch. There's a mag catch on the Sturmgewehr. Interacts with the magazine in a very similar fashion as the one on the Sturmgewehr. Right? But the way that Eugene Stoner and the crew did, they did a great job of eliminating the front to back wobble. It has a little bit, but very little. Nothing like the one the Germans has. Why? Real simple. A lot more support here in terms of the lower receiver and the magazine, which is a real plus. The great thing about this magazine release is you hit it and the empty drops out as a general rule, unless the magazine sticks in the gun, which if that's the case, you need to take a look at your magazines or your lower receiver. But as a general rule, you hit it, drops out. Makes loading it much easier, but the way it locks in, something you got to be a little bit more on top of from a design perspective versus the AK. Now, flipping it over, you can see the ejection port cover. Clearly taken from the Sturmgewehr. In this case, of course, it flips down. The one on the Sturmgewehr flips up. Almost identical in that respect. Great design, works like a champ. Also, how does it work? Well, real simple is spring loaded, and that little scallop cut right there, when it hits essentially the detent, it pops it and flips it open. Same thing with the Sturmgewehr. It has a scallop cut on the side of the bolt, and it hits the plunger, pops it open. Essentially identical copy for all intents and purposes. Another thing that was widely copied, not 100%, but more so than the earlier AKMs, one thing that was copied with the M4, M16 series from the Sturmgewehr was the inline operating mechanism. This forced the sights to be higher. You have a little bit of a drop at the cheek well, but if you look at the bolt carrier, the bore, and the recoil spring, they're all in line. All right. Now, M16, M4, same thing. Bore, bolt carrier, recoil spring is all in line. It allows the gun to be a lot more controllable and get back on target quicker. It also forces you to have the sights higher now to accommodate the distance between your cheek weld and your eye in order to get the proper eye relief. So that's one thing that's kind of overlooked a little bit. If you look at the earlier AKs, whether it be the AK-47 or the AKM series, they have a little bit more drop to the buttstock along the lines of an M1 Garand or whatnot. So the sights are lower, but now when you fire the gun, the operating group isn't completely in line and you get more vertical rise. That was largely fixed or addressed with the AK-74 series and to some degree the AKM series. But with the earlier AKs, they have a little bit more drop to them, and you get a little more muzzle rise because of it.